All right, everyone, thank you very much. My name is Sergio Marrero, and today I'm going to talk about building startups. And more specifically, I'm going to share a little bit about my journey, talk about my research that I started at the Harvard Business School and the Kennedy School of Government, focused on startup factories, that these organizations accelerating the pace of innovation and launching new ventures into the world. My journey started launching an organization focused on creating a mobile app that delivers job training on your mobile phone. And we brought together an all-star team between Harvard and MIT. We got into a global accelerator program called Startup Chile, and we went down to South America, worked several months, launched a venture. That application didn't get the user traction that we expected. We didn't agree on where to move forward, and eventually ended up winding that down. And it was through that experience, through surviving that experience, that I've become obsessed with how do you streamline the process in launching new startups and bringing them into the world. And I'm going to share a bit of that with you today. As an engineer, I believe every problem has multiple solutions, and so I focused on how to outline a process and really help early-stage entrepreneurs and companies launch new ventures. My journey started first at an innovation and design firm where we did user research in the field. We turned those into insights. We turned those insights into concepts and really going through the design thinking methodology, if you're familiar with it. I also put the theory to practice, focusing on reinventing the men's wallet, made an alternative that was super thin, made of cork instead of leather. And going through that, understood that the design thinking process was great at developing concepts, but not really from going from concept to company. So to understand what it takes to make that next leap, I worked in venture capital, and these are firms that invest in winning startups. And to understand the milestones and metrics that they use with the intent of baking that into the creation process. And it was from that point that I took a step back and made a framework for myself to understand the whole startup journey. So to share it with you now, when you're starting an organization, there's first the 0 to 1. And this is what Peter Thiel, he's a well-known investor, invested in Facebook, talks about bringing new ideas to the world. Next, there's this 1 to many, and this is the messy phase that the startup team is finding a repeatable process, it starts to begin to make money, and they become sustainable. Then there's the many to scale, and this is what large companies are good at, where they are taking the product and they're bringing it out to different regions and different populations. It was going through this research that I was exposed to these companies that were going through this process at 9 to 10 times faster than normal. You're talking about where it takes an entrepreneur 1 to 3 years, maybe even more, to go through the first process. They were going through this they were doing this in a few months. And it was really incredible. So, there we go. So I call these entities startup factories. They were companies that were launching new ventures quickly into the world, also known as startup studios, company builders, and foundries. And these are some of those organizations that I looked into. And I looked into the people, the processes, the technology, the business models. You know, what do they actually do to accelerate this pace? And you'll know some of these organizations, they're all very different. Some create digital products, some physical, some focus on new technologies such as blockchain. But in the end, they had these secrets, if you will, or these, I call them keys to acceleration. And I'm going to share a few of them with you today. Those keys to acceleration really are going to fit into 4 main categories focused on the team, how the team worked, the structure of the startup factory, and the environment they created for these ventures. So first, they had these 4 capabilities of deep expertise within the team: business, tech, design, and research. And I like to think of it as you're building your startups and startup teams. Every person is you're building your league of superheroes. Each person has a superpower. You should know and actively talk about what they are, and these are some keys to that. Tech, so that somebody can build it. Design, so that they're making sure that it interacts well with the population you're trying to serve. The hound is the sales. You need to close sales and make money, or your startup will not succeed. And the researcher is really focused on understanding what the world wants and iterating on that. And while this expertise was not necessarily within just the startup team, but also within the studio. Another thing that they did is they had a founder that was there from the beginning and at least through the product market fit phase. And I'll explain why this was key. Is as you're going through the process of building something, putting it out to the world, testing and learning, they call it the lean startup methodology, you're collecting learnings. And as you're collecting all this knowledge and experience and the startup hits walls, you need a founder that's identifying new patterns and new ways of moving forward, and that's key. Next, early stage startups, these startup factories are co-creating with ventures. So today, if you imagine every startup as a child that exists in the world, the entities that are designed to help them, talk about accelerators, investors, incubators, all adopt their children. They go through hundreds and thousands of applications and cherry pick the ones that they want to help. Startup factories were slightly different. They were working with founders before they even started a project, so that they were on the same page identifying what they should do next. Next, they involve investors early in the process. They cut down a process where the founder, that usually takes hundreds of hours and several months of pitching to investors and trying to get them to invest, and brought it down to a single day in several hours. It was pretty amazing. Also, one trick they use is they co-located the investor in the same area as the startup team so that they can ask them lots of questions to tap into their expertise. And this eliminated administrative updating and sometimes board meetings. Another thing they did is they experimented fast so that they learned as quickly as possible. And to give you a sense of that, this picture is not of a calendar of what's taking place over the course of a month. This is a breakdown of what's taking place over a week, broken down hour by hour. And that's how quickly these teams were testing. Next, it was important that these startups, if you're creating them in a startup factory, are independent. As soon as they showed early signs of product market fit, they were active users and paying customers, they filed as a separate legal company, even if it was 1 to 3 people in the same building. And the reason that was so that they can get used to being independent and also accept outside funding if someone wants to support them. And I relate this to a hive. You think about everybody's working, every bee is working in a common thread, but the bee can go off, come back, build in a different direction, and even go build a new hive. And it's important that startups are given that same independence. Next, if you're creating different types of ventures, sharing ownership really aligned, and specifically equity, really aligned with founders taking risks. And to share a little bit more about that, there were startup factories that were innovating. They were just copying what was out there, right? And they didn't share a large portion of equity. But if they wanted to be disruptive, if they wanted to create a new market, it was more likely than not they were sharing a majority of the ownership with the founding team to incentivize them to take those risks. Next, they created communities of shared ventures in the same place. So to share a little bit more about incubators and accelerators, they usually have a group of startups come in, they train, and then they leave, right? And there's no knowledge that's passed on from generation to generation. These places were slightly different. They had teams that were located side by side. In visiting this startup factory, it was hard to tell who was on which team. But the amazing thing that happened is as startups grew, they would naturally learn from one another. There was a lot of serendipitous communication. And then also the startup factory itself developed an unfair competitive advantage. They had so much knowledge on particular industries or particular technologies that it was hard for others to compete. And last but not least, startup factories are part of an ecosystem. They don't exist in a silo. So they had relationships with companies, with investors, with universities. And the only time that this was different, they didn't exist on their own, was in developing countries where the startup factories were actually the nucleus and the very beginnings of their entrepreneurial ecosystem. So these are just a few of the key accelerators that I observed in studying startup factories, and the big idea that I wanted to share with you today is we can accelerate the pace of launching new ventures and more easily bring startups into the world. And the organizations and people that take on this challenge will not only outcompete as they go into the future, they will have the opportunity to shape the world. Thank you.